The idea that a country's humanity can be judged on its prison system is reflected in the Nelson Mandela rules, which state that a nation should not be judged by how it treats its highest citizens, but how it treats its lowest. Because it's really hard to claim the moral authority you need to hand out punishments when your government's humanity is in the toilet. By international standards, those countries with the death penalty are already walking a fine line here. But how they treat the deceased after execution is the final nail in the coffin for many countries' humanity. Before we begin, we post death and dying related videos every Friday, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, consider subscribing to the channel. Now let's talk what happens to prisoners' bodies after execution. So this was a subscriber recommended video, so thank you. I hadn't thought of this topic because we don't have the death penalty here, so I'm glad you brought it up. Now, we're not here to discuss whether the death penalty is right or wrong, because the fact is it's still happening today, and what happens to an inmate's body after execution is an issue for today. There are 55 countries with the death penalty on the books still. But we did do a video a while ago about how that's not actually as black and white as whether they do or do not have it, so go check that video out afterwards. As you can imagine, many countries aren't that open about the topic, and strangely, it's pretty difficult to find information regarding what happens to an inmate's body after they're executed. But here's what we could find for Japan, Egypt, India, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, China, and the USA. Japan. Execution in Japan is carried out by long drop hanging and are usually reserved for those who have committed multiple murders. After the execution is carried out, prison staff remove the noose, wash the corpse after being inspected by a doctor, dress the corpse in garments appropriate to the deceased's religion, usually a white gown, as most Japanese are Buddhist or Shinto, and place the corpse in a coffin. Prison staff then accompany the prison chaplain as they perform a simple funeral service at the mortuary in the prison. Then, depending on the religion and the region, the prisoner's body is cremated in the prison's mortuary. Each prison with death row has a small ossuary on the premises where the cremated remains of inmates are kept whose families refuse the remains. Or, on rare occasions, they are sent elsewhere for burial, in which case the prison staff salute and see off the deceased in formation when the coffin leaves the premises. Now you may ask why the family of the deceased isn't involved, and there are two reasons for this. One, the vast majority of death row inmates in Japan have been disowned by their families, keeping in mind that personal and family reputation is a big deal in Japan and can affect everything in your life, including your job and relationships. And two, the prisoner, the family, and not even the prison staff know that an inmate will be executed until 12 hours before it happens, and there are not allowed to be any members of the public as witnesses. As a side note, because I found it interesting, in an interview with an ex-prison commander, he said the reason prison guards aren't even told in advance that there will be an execution is for a few reasons. Firstly, so that the news doesn't get out and they don't have to deal with the media and activists on their doorstep. Secondly, it is believed to be less of a drain on the staff's mental health if they don't have time to dwell on the idea. But he said thirdly, and mostly, because in the past, prison staff were given a week's notice and then suddenly most of the staff would be sick or have a family emergency on that day and just not show up for work. I thought that was a really interesting insight. But back to the family and the body. The executions are done secretly without the knowledge of inmates' family members or lawyers to prevent emotional scenes and last-minute appeals. By the time families and lawyers are told, the deceased body is already growing cold in the prison's morgue. Relatives, if they have any that are willing, have 24 hours to pick up the corpse. Nowadays, once the execution takes place, the Justice Ministry releases the name and crime of the inmate executed. But up until a couple of years ago, after the condemned had been killed, the state sent news agencies a notification by fax, and a typical announcement would read something like this: "Today in Tokyo, 2 death row convicts were executed." That's it. The names of the deceased were not revealed, though journalists, being the savvy professionals they are, usually manage to find out pretty quickly. The facts may not have even indicated which prison was making the announcement. Actually, until 1999, the government did not make any post-execution announcements at all, so journalists learnt about it through attorneys and family members when they were told that their client or loved one was gone. In some cases, the death was only discovered after mail addressed to the deceased was returned to the sender unopened. Saudi Arabia. According to the observations of the European Saudi Organization for Human Rights, the Saudi government's treatment during and after the execution process varies a lot based on the type of charge. In a criminal case, such as a homicide, the body is handled with a certain amount of dignity, or at least what dignity you can have when you're chasing around a head in the main square like a rogue bowling ball. The bodies of these inmates are allowed to be buried by their families and to have Islamic rituals conducted. But that's if you're a Saudi citizen. We'll get back to foreigners in a bit. However, if you are executed because of a political crime, which can be pretty much anything in Saudi Arabia, no one is going to know where your body is. Actually, most of the time, they won't even know that you've been sentenced to execution, or sentenced at all, or even arrested. No one really knows what happens to political prisoners' bodies after execution over there. They could be thrown in the desert or in the sea, chopped into little pieces and fed to rich people's tigers, blown up for funsies, who knows? Everything is a crapshoot when it comes to the Saudis, although all those possibilities have been raised by experts. So they very obviously don't care about the souls of their Muslim brothers and sisters, just saying. Human rights organisations that are monitoring the country have confirmed that most families of individuals sentenced to death in political cases learn about the execution through media outlets. Additionally, the suffering of families continues after execution as Saudi Arabia refuses to comply with requests to release the bodies, and currently they are holding on to at least 140 bodies. But again, whether those bodies are actually still in possession of the government or they've been dumped somewhere is anyone's guess. And what about foreigners? Saudi Arabia executes a lot of foreigners, which already pisses off the international community because they're often not given the right to have any defense and the charges are often questionable. But even worse than that is Saudi Arabia does not respond to the demands of foreign families to receive the bodies of their executed children. They won't give them back. Experts claim this is because torture is endemic in Saudi prison system, especially for foreigners, and obviously they don't want foreign media and governments having actual proof that this is going on, and they reckon that's why they will never send the bodies home. And I suspect images coming out of a body after a beheading probably wouldn't be great for PR either. Egypt. In Article 72 of Egypt's Organisation of Prison Regulations, it states that the corpse of a person sentenced to execution shall be delivered to his relatives if they so request and the administration agrees. Burial must be without ceremony. If 24 hours elapse without any of his relatives coming to take delivery of his corpse, it shall be deposited at the nearest place to the prison where corpses can be kept. If no one of his relatives comes forward to take delivery of it within 7 days from the day it is deposited, it shall be delivered to university agency. This would make sense. As we said in our video on modern corpse theft, Muslim countries have a really hard time securing cadavers for their medical students and often buy them in from abroad because you aren't supposed to desecrate a Muslim's body. But I guess if you're executed, your faith doesn't count in Egypt. China. China. Who wants to take a guess where this goes? So in China, the majority of executions are done by lethal injection nowadays. Apparently, it's much more economical to execute thousands of people per year that way, even after you've had to create an entire fleet of execution vans. Firing squad is still used, particularly for those convicted of violent crimes. Executed individuals are cremated by the state and then the family is called to collect the cremains. They are not allowed to see the body and there is no funeral service allowed. Now, why could that be? Could be that the Chinese government wants to spare the families the pain of seeing the deceased. Yeah, no, that's not it. Could be that the Chinese government is gifting the family a free cremation to make up for the honour that the family has lost due to their criminal family member. No, that ain't it either. Organs. It's organ trafficking. Bodies are not released to family members because the Chinese government has a long-standing practice of harvesting organs from executed prisoners and selling them to the highest bidder. In 2014, China's most senior official responsible for organ transplantation stated that China would end the procurement of organs from prisoners by the 1st of January 2015. In 2017, China's officials stated that they were not possible to guarantee that the use of organs from prisoners had ceased, and it was thought that the practice remains widespread. And to be clear, it's not just the wealthy Chinese that are buying these organs. People around the globe are buying these organs, from the USA, Germany, Australia, the list goes on. This is a billion-dollar industry for China. And you know those seafood restaurants where the lobster or whatever is killed and cooked to order? That's what's happening in China. The buyer needs a kidney and whatever blood type, and they'll be here on a certain day. The prison looks up the appropriate prisoner who has the appropriate kidney and is in the area. They execute him, and the order is delivered straight to the operating room. And worse, there is a lot of evidence suggesting that these inmates are not even properly dead at the time their organs are harvested, because China does not conform to international standards of medical ethics when it comes to the determination of death. In practice, in China, declaring death by lethal injection happens within seconds of the drug being given, which is not sufficient time for it to work. So while this explains a lot, and we have a huge amount of evidence to back it up, there are other concerns as well. Remember this, the Real Bodies Expo that toured around the world? It was the knockoff version of the German one. Well, where the bodies that were on display at the German one had given their consent while alive, the Chinese one was a different story. The organisers claimed that 20 cadavers were legally provided by medical university in China and were unclaimed bodies. But this can't be true because Chinese hospitals keep bodies for 30 days until declaring them unclaimed. But the plasticization process needed for the exhibit must commence within 48 hours of death. So whichever way you cut it, families of the executed in China are never seeing their loved one's body again. It's like a morbid recycling plant over there. India. In India, hanging is the method used for all citizen executions. Following the execution, it is law that the body must be taken for autopsy. But why? A quote from the Indian court explains, "By making the performance of post-mortem obligatory, the cause of the death of the convict can be found out, which will reveal whether the person died as a result of the dislocation of the cervical vertebrae or by strangulation, which results on account of too long of a drop." The apex court had said in this order, "Our constitution permits the execution of death sentence only through the procedure established by law, and this procedure must be just, fair and reasonable," the order added. Essentially, the law says that the prisoner must die of a break to the neck during hanging, not strangulation, and we must check that that has been done. He also went on to say that there are severe punishments for executioners who mess it up and don't get the rope measurements right, or in other ways mess up the execution. As to whether the family can claim the body after execution, the Model Prison Manual for the Superintendence and Management of Prisons in India lays down the guidelines regarding the body of death row convicts being claimed. Clause 1167, which deals with the disposal of the body, states that if an executed prisoner's relatives make a written application for performing last rites, the superintendent may, in his discretion, allow such a request, provided that the relatives give an undertaking in writing that they will not make a public demonstration at the cremation or burial. In cases where the superintendent thinks that there is a likelihood of public demonstration, he has the authority to refuse such permission. In clause 1168, it states that the body of the executed prisoner shall be taken out of the prison with all solemnity. A municipal hearse or ambulance shall be used for the transportation of the body to the cremation or burial ground. The superintendent is authorised to incur all reasonable expenditure required for the transportation and disposal of the dead body. North Korea. A huge number of interviews has been conducted with those who have escaped North Korea over the years, and they give us some insight into post-execution practices, not that there's much to say. It would seem that the bodies of individuals killed by the regime are not usually returned to family members, nor are the burial locations revealed to families, no matter if the execution was public or private. Burial and the reverence of ancestors is still a big part of North Korean culture, no matter how much the regime tries to eliminate it. The bodies of those who are accused of crimes and then executed, often in front of large crowds, are typically taken away by the Ministry of People's Security, MPS, for disposal. One former MPS officer described transporting 4 bodies of individuals who he had seen executed to an otherwise unremarkable site not far from the execution ground. A 1-metre deep hole had been dug in advance, and this officer witnessed 6 other officers carry the body to the hole, filling it and leaving it unmarked. Other interviewees told of bodies being thrown into ravines in the mountains. Hi all, if you're finding this video interesting, please show us some love and click the like and subscribe buttons below. And if you really like it, perhaps consider sharing it with others. Now, onwards. USA. In the USA, there is no federal law regarding the disposal of the remains of executed inmates. Instead, each state has its own laws and regulations governing this matter. I would imagine this is because the states are a tad divided on the issue. To recap, 23 states do not have the death penalty, 4 states have a pause on executions by executive action, and 23 states have the death penalty on the books. So that's 23 states that could all have different laws regarding on what happens to the body after the execution, and none of them are all that forthcoming with the info. Oh, and they really are not forthcoming when you, as a non-US person, request that information. But here's the info I could get my hands on. So in some states, such as Florida, Virginia, and Oklahoma, the bodies must be sent to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. However, the inmate can say in advance that they do not want one for whatever reason, and then it's up to the medical examiner whether they will continue or not. In other states, such as Louisiana and Alabama, it is not required by law for an autopsy to be done. But why is there being an autopsy done when we know how they died? Because the states that do require it to be done acknowledge in their own laws that execution comes under the category of murder, and at least where the medical examiner is concerned, all murders must be investigated through autopsy. And unfortunately, what the medical examiners are so often finding is that the anesthesia is not working. And I will put this report in the description, but a few state medical examiners came together to assess over 200 autopsy cases of executions conducted by lethal injection, and 84% of those cases the anesthesia did not work. Now, why is that important? Because they were sentenced to execution by the stated lethal injection process, which included being anaesthetized before the other drugs were given. They were not sentenced to death by torture, of which this would now qualify. Anyway, read the report. It was sent through to the state governments in 2020 and has now been sent on to the federal level because it's violating citizens' 8th Amendment rights about cruel and unusual punishment. And quite frankly, I'm shocked I was able to get a hold on this information so readily, because no matter which side of the debate you're on, this is not a good look. But let's move on. Who has the right to claim the body? In most states, the family have the right to claim the body, in which case all funeral, transport and disposal costs are on them. For a while there, up until a few years ago, most states allowed anyone to claim the body if the next of kin refused. But people were trying to claim serial killers' bodies and the like so that they could put them on display and make money off them. And even though he wasn't executed, there was massive fighting in the courts about who could take claim of Charles Manson's body when he died. So yeah, it happens. Anyway, each state quietly put an end to that nonsense. But when a family claim the body, they have a funeral director pick up the body from the prison morgue or the medical examiner's office, and from there it's the same as any other family organising a funeral. But what happens if the family refuses to claim the body, or they can't afford to dispose of the body? This is where things get murky. If the inmate was executed in one of the states that requires an autopsy, then it is up to the medical examiner to handle it like any other unclaimed body. They are usually held onto for a while before being cremated and then disposed of in a collective grave. And hopefully nothing sus happens between these points, because as we've learnt in past videos, there is a bit of an illegal body trade problem in the US, so the actually getting from one place to the other isn't guaranteed. Because you would think that, well, they have lethal poison in them now from the execution, so they couldn't use their bodies for organ donation, right? Oh, so innocent. These arse hats don't care about that. There are body parts floating around from them that have HIV. But luckily for those who get an autopsy, the chief medical examiners and their officers are usually quality, ethical people who won't let that happen. Also, it's hard to retrieve an organ of any usable state after an autopsy anyway. However, in those states that don't require an autopsy, it's free reign. Alabama in particular has a pretty big problem with this, and a bigger problem in that they can't seem to hide the issue very well. They have sold executed bodies that the family couldn't claim. They have sold generally deceased inmates' bodies that the family couldn't claim. They have also dissected and sold off organs of generally deceased inmates before giving the bodies back to families, only to be found out when the funeral home took a look. And seriously, how did they not think they would be found out for that one? But for those who do not have an autopsy, are not sold, and whose family can't or won't claim the bodies, most death row prisons have cemeteries of their own. Now, as an Australian, a private institution such as a prison having its own cemetery does not sit well with me. It's just not a thing we do here. And it brings to mind old school mental asylums and Indigenous boarding schools back in the day where they're still finding mass graves. And that's exactly what happened in Mississippi last year. 215 bodies were discovered in unmarked graves behind a state jail called Hinds County Penal Farm. The families of those buried in what's known as a pauper's field were never informed of the death of their loved ones, let alone given the chance to retrieve their bodies and pay their respects. Makes you wonder just how many more are out there. What happens to the body of an executed prisoner is just as varied as each country's reasons for having the death penalty in the first place. And the countries we have looked at are just the ones that we could find information on. So I do hope you found this one interesting. If you have, give us a like and click the subscribe button if you're new here. And with that, go talk death.